Okay. So this is a COP27 briefing. I just want to introduce the NUS Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, where I'm based. So our core expertise in these areas. We do research relating to carbon offsets, markets and trade, blue carbon, science and conservation. Our colleagues also do climate modeling and data science, geospatial monitoring, biodiversity, of course. And this is where today's talk is situated in, is international climate policies and strategies. And so really just our strategic research focus is to seek to understand the key problems on biodiversity and climate change, as well as to identify solutions and actions that we can work together with partners on. Just to show you what our staff and students are doing right now in terms of research, but you can come back to this at a later time as well. So NUS has been accredited to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change since Lima in Peru COP, I believe it was 20 in 2014. And so the COP stands for the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and is the supreme decision-making body of the UNFCCC. And as you know, it meets every year unless parties decide otherwise. I'll just point you to this website if you want to find out more about what NUS is doing at the COP. So it's sustainability.nus.edu.sg. And so this is what we do, and it covers, the whole website will cover basically what we've been up to in the last few years, attending the COP meetings. Yeah. Let me just admit everyone in the room, in the waiting room. Okay. So the overview that I'll be sharing today, and I have very little time to do it, in an hour, basically trying to cover an introduction to the international climate change regime. And I'll take you through the key elements of the Paris Agreement, because my sense is that if one is not familiar with the key elements of the Paris Agreement, it could be difficult to follow the COP27 agenda, particularly if you plan to go this year or next year, or generally are interested to follow what's going on in the international climate change regime. So please bear with me, especially those who already know this. And of course, when we talk about the Paris Agreement, we have to talk about its implementation rulebook, or we call it the Paris Rulebook. And because it was signed and adopted in Katowice, Poland, the rulebook is also sometimes referred to as the Katowice Climate Package. And so what you guys are here for today, of course, is to learn more about the COP26 outcomes, as well as the COP27 agenda, what's on the table. In 21 days' time, when we go to Sharm-el-Sheik to negotiate an outcome. And we'll end off with a logistics briefing for observers who plan to attend the COP this year. Okay, and then finally, we'll end off with some useful tips and tools for you to best be prepared for the COP. So this is what the international climate regime looks like. It started in 1992 with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I like to call this the umbrella convention, from which comes the Kyoto Protocol. I think many of you will be familiar with, where 37 developed countries were required to put forward obligations on their greenhouse gas emissions and limit them. And the Doha Amendment is an amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, extending the commitment period from 2013 to 2020. And then came the Paris Agreement in 2015. So this is how it broadly looks like. But at the bottom, you'll also see that there are other UN bodies that also address climate change. So not forgetting the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, the Convention on Combating Desertification, which are in fact siblings of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, because they were all crafted and adopted together at the Real Earth Summit in 1992. And then there's the Montreal Protocol. I think some of you will be familiar with. It deals with ozone depleting substances. Then there's the International Maritime Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the World Meteorological Organization, and so forth. right? So today we're just going to focus on these bodies relating and treaties relating to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But if you're interested, please go look up some of the other UN agencies that address climate change and biodiversity law. So with regard to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as the name itself suggests, it is a framework convention. So what it establishes is an international environmental treaty that would limit greenhouse gas concentrations to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interferences with the climate system. It's very broad. It has general obligations, no specific targets as to what each country needs to do. And so it's a framework convention, right? Easy to sign up to, and it had near universal participation, 198 parties as of this year. And if you're confused with the way COPs are titled, please don't be. It's very straightforward. So the first meeting of the Conference of Parties will be labeled as the COP, right? COP1. So the numbers come based on the numbers of COP that have been had. So COP27 essentially means it's the 27th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And because the Kyoto Protocol was only adopted in 1994-5, thereabouts, and came into force in 2005, the first meeting was held many years later. So the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, is a subset of the Conference of the Parties, right? So usually it's COP27, CMP 17, because the Kyoto Protocol only came into force and the parties only started meeting 10 years later, right, when the Kyoto Protocol was in force. And then, of course, you have the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, right, the latest treaty or the latest sibling, if you will, of the Kyoto Protocol. So it comes after, it succeeds the Kyoto Protocol. So then, of course, you call it the CMA. So CMA is currently in its fourth sitting at Sharm-el-Sheik at COP27. Okay, so don't be confused. Basically, the numbers relate to the number of times the parties are meeting. And the reason why it needs to be this way is because not all parties, not all countries have signed up or ratified all of the agreements at the same time, right? It's not a given that when a country signs it at the meeting itself, that their domestic regulations and laws allow them to ratify. So in order to ratify is another step. They actually have to bring a document to the UN headquarters in New York City in the United States and deposit it, right? And as some of you may be aware, countries like the United States never ever signed up to the Kyoto Protocol. We signed it, but then never ratified it, right? And of course, the US similarly had retracted its admittance to the Paris Agreement when President Donald Trump was in the White House, and later on, President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement. So parties, depending on the clauses and provisions given in the agreement itself, they can remove themselves or rejoin as they wish, right? Because all countries are sovereign. So under these three supreme governing bodies, there are also several other subsidiary bodies that you might find, and we'll go through a bit later as to what they do and what sort of settings you might, the formats that the meetings might be conducted in. And if you are going to COP, this will be very helpful for you because the meetings will not be labeled, in terms of how you imagine it will be labeled. It might be labeled in terms of agenda items, right? Instead of COP meeting on a mitigation or CMP meeting on the clean development mechanism, right? It will be based on the agenda items provided by the UNFCCC Secretariat. Okay, and then there are also constituted bodies, which are essentially, as you see here in the slide, these are technical committees and expert groups that are established by the supreme governing bodies in order to continue on some work that require experts to be involved and technical experts to be involved. And they go through very, very fine details about how to implement the agreements or treaties. And of course, all of this needs money, and countries that become party to each of these treaties effectively have to pay some form of fee And that funds the Secretariat's work, and it funds the COP meetings that you go to as well. So all the nice signage, tentage, computers that you attend and you get to use for free. It's not free because your government has probably paid some money to be a part of the UN multilateral process, and therefore you get to enjoy it for free. Okay, then you probably pay tax to get it for free. Okay, so just a different way of providing that same information, right? The convention, or UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, was established in 1992, but only entered into force. And entry into force really comes about when enough countries have ratified and deposited that document that I mentioned earlier. And once they do that, they become parties, and the rules embedded in those treaties apply to those countries, right? So you have to follow the rules that are decided effectively by yourself, because you have participated in the negotiations in order to get to those consensus outcomes. Then the Kyoto Protocol, I mentioned the commitment period was from 2008 to 2012. It has about 193 parties. It might have changed a little bit by now. Some countries have actually dropped out of the Kyoto Protocol since it, basically is no longer in force, because its commitment period 2, which is affected by the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, ended 31st December 2020. Okay, so the commitments for the Kyoto Protocol and its Doha Amendment were primarily for 37 developed country parties. And you know this term, Annex 1, because literally there is an annex called Annex 1 to the Kyoto Protocol that lists these 37 developed countries. And developing countries are typically referred to as non-Annex 1 because they are not contained in that list. Okay, so there is a form of bifurcation with regard to the rules, right? The Kyoto Protocol's rules are contained in this document called the Marrakech Accords. And those rules will refer to differentiated guidelines for both Annex 1 developed countries and non-Annex 1 developing country parties. But all you need to know today is that developed countries were required at the time to reduce a total of 5.2% of global emissions from 1990 levels by the end of their commitment period, which is 2012. And then the Doha Amendment increased those commitments to 18% below 1990 levels. And it was a bit of a tricky situation because only in October 2020, as you can see at the last bullet point here, there were 2/3 of countries, I think it was 2/3 of countries that were required to deposit their instrument of acceptance. So basically, it only left countries between 28 October 2020 and 31st December 2020 to achieve those commitments, right? 18% below 1990 levels. But anyway, today we're going to focus on the Paris Agreement. Okay, so hope that gives you a good background into international climate policy and where we are today and how we got here. So I wanted to share with you that if you think that the Paris rulebook, right, and don't ever take it for granted because it really took quite a bit of time, like 3 years to put together. The Paris Agreement is actually really a landmark agreement that was adopted in 2015, 13 December at COP21 in Paris, right? And it entered into force something like 11 months into, after the Paris Agreement was adopted. And this is because the threshold for entry, right, is contained in Article 21 of the Paris Agreement, which is 30 days on which at least 55 parties to the convention, which is the UNFCCC, has deposited their instruments, right? And these countries have to exceed 55% coverage of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So basically what this means, to break it down for you, is it doesn't make sense for a treaty to enter into force unless more than half of the countries and half of the global emissions is covered by this treaty. It would not be effective if less than this number, right? This is the threshold beyond which it makes sense. So of course we push. And one of the worries, of course, the lessons we learned from the Kyoto Protocol is that when the US did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, we couldn't even reach this level of half, because at the time, the US was the largest emitter in the world. Okay, so the Paris Agreement was designed so that this threshold for entry would be met faster. And one way to do that is through the intended nationally determined contributions. If you're confused already, I'll go through what intended nationally determined contributions are. They're basically climate pledges. But I want to highlight that there was unprecedented early entry into force of the Paris Agreement because of the level of confidence, right, that countries had. They knew it was going to work, so they ratified it to the point where the following COP in Marrakech, which is the last African COP, right? So this year's COP is going to be in COP27 is going to be in Egypt. This COP27. The last time a COP was held in North Africa, it was in Marrakech, COP22, and you can see just by the name of the way the logo was designed, they didn't even think that the Paris Agreement was going to come into force, and the first meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement was going to be held. So they had to add the CMA1 at the end of the logo there. And I just think this is a really great illustration of how quick and unprecedented that entry into force of the Paris Agreement was. And nobody expected it, but it was really great for morale. But the other thing that happened while we were at Marrakech was also President Trump was elected as president. And so the feeling in the room was quite mixed. Okay, so moving on to the Paris Agreement itself. So I think some of you may be familiar with the Paris Agreement, you may have read it, but I would strongly encourage you to also read the Paris Agreement with the accompanying decision. So decision 1 CP21 is really important. I often liken it to minutes to the meeting, right? So you have to read it because it tells you who has to do what by when and to what effect, right? What is it that gives effect and implementation, effective, putting meat to the bones, right, of the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement is very readable. You should be able to pick it up, anybody, any age, you should be able to understand what it's about, what the core objectives are. The decision 1 CP21 is the document that gives effect to the Paris Agreement, and it had established at the time anyway, a process to develop the rules to the Paris Agreement, right? So the Paris rule book that, of course, today we know exists, but at the time in December 2015, we didn't know what the rules were going to be. And keep that in mind, right? When you don't know what the rules are going to be, your targets that countries put forward are not going to be particularly meaningful or ambitious, because who knows, right? What kind of stringent or not so stringent rules will be put on the table and negotiated. So just keep that in mind. The rules were not agreed in 2015. They were agreed over 3 years. What I want to highlight and remember I talked about the Kyoto Protocol only covering 37 developed countries, right? The Paris Agreement is designed to be very different from the Kyoto Protocol in that it covers all countries that are party to the UN, so the parent, right, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Paris Agreement covers everyone. It doesn't distinguish between developed and developing as much as the Kyoto Protocol does. Okay, so just keep that in mind, because all of the rules that were designed effectively are not differentiated as much as the Kyoto Protocol's rules. Okay, so these are the key elements. So I won't be going through everything today, but if you were to refer to, if you wanted to think about NDCs and mitigation, right, it's not just the Paris Agreement articles that you want to read. You also want to read the decision text, right? And I think another update to this slide would be what the rule book says. So then I probably would add in the second column, decision X, CMA X, because the parties to the Paris Agreement have actually agreed on rules in Katowice, right, at COP24. So, but in general, if you only wanted to start with the Paris Agreement, these will be the articles and the accompanying paragraphs from Decision 1 CP21 that you would read. Okay, so it's a lot, I know, and my recommendation is if you are going to COP for the first time or just starting to get into Paris Agreement and starting to understand, don't try to do everything, right? So you want to pick something to enter into the discussion and learn a bit more about, and then start to build up across the issues. And why this is important is because everything is actually interlinked, right? So you submit an NDC, for example, under Article 4, you then later on have to submit a transparency report under Article 13, and then if not, you have to go towards the implementation and compliance committee. So it's all very much linked, right? But it takes a bit of time to go through and understand the elements and what they mean and what they do, especially if you are trying maybe in your work and advocacy, trying to see if your government is fulfilling the terms of the Paris Agreement, especially if they are a party to it. So take your time with it, basically, that's what I'm saying. Okay, so Decision 1 CP21 is not as long as I make it out to be probably, but it's only 36 pages. So, but you do want to read it side by side with the Paris Agreement. It's called the adoption decision, right? And you see here paragraph 10 of Decision 1 CP21. It's established this ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement. We call it the APA, to complete its work on the rulebook by the first CMA. Now, what's the problem with this? The Paris Agreement entered into force too fast, right? So when it entered into force in Marrakech the following year, parties couldn't complete their work yet because it was only 1 year. So they had to revise this and say that it gave them 3 years to do the work. Okay, so the Paris rulebook was actually developed from 2016, starting in Marrakech, to 2019. But as many of you now know, the certain elements were not able to be finalized at Katowice in COP24. So this includes some of the transparency reporting tables, and it also includes some of the Article 6 negotiations that, as you know, basically dominated the headlines last year at Glasgow. Okay, so basically you can see here, if things don't get agreed at specific COPs that they are asked to, then it will just roll over. And it's not great if it rolls over sometimes, because obviously the people in charge of those topics will have to continue the work negotiating with their counterparts from other countries, but also it adds to the ever increasing agenda of the COPs. Okay, so what are NDCs? I mentioned I will explain this a bit to everyone. So NDCs are nationally determined contributions. They are effectively climate change targets that countries set under the Paris Agreement. Okay, so they, as the name suggests, countries come up with these themselves. It's not top down, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, where 5.2% global emissions, you guys go and decide, right? And it's included in an annex, like who is going to do what. Countries realize that when somebody forces you to do something, it's not very effective, right? And quite often countries refuse to do it. So the design thinking behind the Paris Agreement was that countries prepare and they communicate their own decision on what they will put forward, right? Whether it's a base year emissions target, a fixed level target, if you want to submit a renewable energy target or reduction of deforestation target, by all means, whatever you like, okay? Of course, the trade-off is it's not going to be very ambitious because countries don't know what they are going to collectively put forward, right? So it's only when they submit everything already, then the UN Secretariat or other researchers goes and consolidates all of these, right? Assuming they are comparable, but they might have to do some calculations around emissions factors and all that to decide whether how much of a gap in terms of emissions reductions do we have in order to not burst the 1.5 degree threshold, right? And something that I quite often share with people, 1.5 degrees is not a goal. It's not a target to reach. It's a threshold beyond which, right, climate change could be difficult for some countries to adapt to. So I think it's important not to frame it as a goal. It's a threshold. So another thing to note is that NDCs form part of the Paris Agreement's ambition cycle, wherein every 5 years, countries have to submit an update or a new NDC to the Paris Agreement, right? So every 5 years, and each successive NDC will have to be a progression beyond the parties' then current NDC. So it has to be better. It can't be worse. Okay, this is something very important. And in order to track that, there are several other articles that will be required for countries to adhere to, so that we know that they've made progress. But there's some really great resources online as well. Climate Action Tracker, they literally have a list of countries that they think, based on their methodology, haven't made progress in their NDCs, right? The new NDCs updates. So do check it out. Okay, so as you can see here, you can track yourself, if you like, the submission of NDC. So the first submission was pre-Paris, right? 2015, and then countries resubmitted them as formal NDCs in 2016. So 2020 was the window of opportunity again for countries to resubmit. But as you know, it was COVID, right? The pandemic was around. So the COP26 was pushed. And there is some constructive ambiguity in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement that asks countries to submit a new NDC or successive NDC before the next COP. So because the COP got postponed to 2021, several countries interpreted this as an extension of their deadline as well. Okay, so that's why instead of 2020, we only received the bulk of the NDC updates in 2021 before COP26, effectively because it was postponed due to the pandemic. And also the Glasgow Climate Pact last year, agreed by countries in Glasgow, of course, called on countries to review the NDCs and submit them a new one, assuming also higher ambition by end of 2020. And for those of you based in Singapore, I understand that we are reviewing our NDC and we will be submitting a new one as well, or updated one. I wanted to highlight to you that if you are interested in the broad NDC coverage, what is it about, or what countries have submitted collectively, there is a NDC Synthesis Report, and I've included a link to the report below. The last one was issued on 25th of October 2021. And what I can tell you based on this report is that the coverage overall has increased. So what this means is that countries have adhered to the guidelines where they have to make progress and improve on their last round of NDCs, right? And all of the NDCs cover energy, which is great news because energy typically emits the most for all countries, right? And then most NDCs cover sectors like agriculture, land use change and forestry, waste, and industrial production. Okay, so if you are interested to understand the transition or the progression from each NDC cycle to the next, the NDC Synthesis Report is where you want to go, and it gives you a really great overview and some really nice graphs, like the ones I have on the screen here today. But I did also want to draw you to another key element, which is the long-term low emissions development strategy. You'll find this in Article 4, paragraph 19 of the Paris Agreement. This is the net zero pathway that everybody talks about, right? Actually, in the Paris Agreement, it doesn't say you have to submit a net zero target, okay? Where it does say and recommends is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that's where the science has recommended that we need to meet in order to meet 1.5, all countries in the world have to achieve net zero globally around 2050. Okay, so two related bodies, right? The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Paris Agreement, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change speak to one another, and countries have to pay attention. If you are someone from the government, you would pay attention to all these ongoing discussions in different UN bodies, and you would formulate a long-term strategy or 2050 strategy that is aligned with the science, right? So that's why most countries have put forward long-term low emissions greenhouse gas emissions development strategies, or LEDs, that are compliant or net zero compliant effectively. Okay, so that's what I wanted to share. And you can track countries' net zero emissions targets via many other websites, but I've chosen to show you the one from Climate Action Tracker. And you can see that currently net zero targets cover just 88% of global emissions. Okay, so it's not all of the world's emissions so far, but we're getting there. Okay, so moving very quickly to the guidelines or the rules of the Paris Agreement. What I will say, it took 3 years and then some for Article 6. But this is the moment, the picture here is the moment where Mikhail Kurtika, who was the COP president at the time, he was jumping off the DS because the agreement, there was broad consensus, and he managed to put the gavel down on the Katowice climate package. So it was really celebrated around the world that we had now some rules on NDCs, what they should look like, how should countries account for them, how would they report to have transparency so that we know what people are reporting. And then it established various other committees, and we had also some clarity on a compliance committee that would help nudge countries towards implementing the Paris Agreement. Okay, so some have argued that the rules, although what was achieved was a single set of rules, so no bifurcation, so no Annex 1 and non-Annex 1, developing, right, which is good, but it does offer some latitude for countries that identify as least developed countries, LDCs, as well as small island developing states, SIDS. Okay, so those who lack the capacity to meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement, understanding that they don't have as much as others, the Paris Agreement rulebook does offer something called flexibility. But as you can imagine, there might be some countries that might construe the word flexibility in a different way and say that, oh, because I didn't submit an NDC that looked like that, those rules don't apply to me. Okay, so I think what I'm trying to say here is that there's some constructive ambiguity in the text because it's multilaterally negotiated. So it might irk some people that the rules are not watertight, but they can't be, right? Because it's been multilaterally agreed. And somebody very wise once told me that nobody leaves a negotiation absolutely happy, right? Because it's a compromise among all countries. Okay, so key elements of the Katowice climate package. I'll go through this because there are some issues that remain and will be discussed at COP27. And if you are tracking it very closely, you probably want to know this. So we've gone through this. I won't go in detail, but this is exactly where you find this target, which is this mandate that all parties shall. So what you want to pay attention to is the shalls and shoulds of the various text in that's been agreed. And then you have the outcomes. Okay, no, this is actually more of the one CP21, so decision 1 CP21, and it's asking for countries. Okay, so this is where the rule books come in. The rule book says that all countries shall provide quantifiable information. So as a citizen of a country, right, all of you are, and you are trying to track your country's information that they submit on the NDCs, right? So as to understand what the NDCs refer to, you probably want to look at this guidance because the government is looking at this guidance and they're interpreting it for the submission of the NDCs and the accounting of the NDCs. So I'm sure that for our country, we probably will follow line by line, right? But maybe for some other countries, if the information is not readily available, they might not be able to submit. For example, time series could be a bit difficult for some people. Yeah, okay. And the other thing that's important is how the country considers that its NDC is fair and ambitious. So it's basically an explanation, right, as to why you shouldn't be doing more and why you think yours is fair. And I think for us, this is an important element of further guidance that we want to pay attention to, because there has been some, of course, as some of you may be aware, some criticism about Singapore's relative contribution, right, to the global emissions and what's emitted on land versus what's emitted in other sectors that are not counted in the Paris Agreement, and also the supply chains that we contribute to. So just pay attention to this particular mandate, right, to countries having to submit how it considers NDC fair and ambitious. It's good to track anyway what the country is doing. And finally, of course, NDCs will also have to include mitigation co-benefits if you can find any, right, resulting from adaptation and economic diversification plans. And I think generally this is also applicable to countries like in the Arab group, where they believe that mitigation will adversely affect their economies, right? Because they depend primarily on fossil. So this line, I believe, was put in by not just the Arab group, but also other negotiating groups. Okay, so I think where I'm going with this slide is that I want to highlight to you that I mentioned ambiguity. So where some places we indicate shall apply this guidance, there are other places in the text, right, coming out of the Paris rulebook that says parties are only strongly encouraged. So countries will take this quite literally, right? And they will say, oh, I'm only encouraged, so I might not update my NDC in 2020 with this guidance that was only agreed in 2018 in Katowice. But I believe Singapore was able to do this in time. And then, of course, there's a shall requirement that parties account for NDCs in biennial transparency reports, and these are due December 2024. And I'll talk about transparency in a bit. And then there are other places that are extremely ambiguous, extremely flexible, which they say you may provide other information. So for those of you who are tracking adaptation, this is not great for you, because this particular line says that countries may provide adaptation as a component of NDC. It's not a requirement. And that has implications on funding, has implications on whether the country takes adaptation seriously or not, because adaptation is not required in an NDC specifically. Okay, so this is the sort of hierarchy of shall, should, strongly encourage, and may, that anyone very welcome to pay attention to and argue for or against, I guess. Please note that the NDC guidance will be reviewed, and there will be further guidance if those rules that were agreed in Katowice somehow don't work, doesn't make sense implementation-wise, then it will be reviewed and updated in 2024. Which is not very long away. So yep. All right. So and I think somebody also did a calculation. I don't know if it was me, but I did a calculation on how many, if applicable, may as appropriate. So these are all how countries put in place a bit more flexibility, right? So if a certain rule doesn't apply to you because it's not applicable to you, right, in 5 places, then you can exclude those rules, right? And so these are just something for you to note. And if you're worried, if you're concerned that countries don't see that all rules apply to them, it's generally because the rules are designed in this way, right? It's quite open-ended in some places. Okay, so common timeframes is actually everything is important, so if I keep repeating it, I'm sorry, but it is all important because the NDCs that were submitted in 2016, many of them were in all, I would say they're all shapes and sizes, which makes them really incomparable. So countries agreed to communicate NDCs in a common time frame. So I won't go into detail on this, but basically the timeframes will be 10 years, right? And they will communicate, let's say, in 2030, they will communicate a new NDC 10 years, so 2040 and so forth. Okay, so otherwise the NDCs don't square up at the same time, and it's very difficult to do any stock take of what countries are actually putting forward. Okay. Transparency is something very close to my heart, and I'll go through this as quickly as I can. But really is that because the NDCs are self-determined or nationally determined, what this means is that the only way to really track that countries are making progress on their targets is through reporting, right? You have to make them report what they've achieved so that we know that they're achieving what they said they want to achieve. So all countries shall provide these reports, right? Applicable to everybody is the same set of guidelines, unlike in previous ongoing rounds of MRV or measurement, reporting, and verification, which is divided between developed and developing. So, most importantly, support will be provided, right? Shall be provided to developing country parties if they don't have the capacity to report on their NDCs. So something, if you come from a country that has difficulty or who hasn't submitted their biennial update report so far, right? and will need support for the biennial transparency report, please ask them to go and get help via the UNFCCC website. Okay, so basically going through what the MPGs are, right? So single set of reporting guidelines for all countries. Yeah, so from 2024 onwards, they have to use IPCC 2006 guidelines and cover all 7 gases, right? Before it was 6 gases under the Kyoto Protocol. And all countries will need to participate in a technical expert review and a facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, or FMCP. So what this means, they have to present their report to everybody and then take questions. Right? It keeps them accountable, right? So, and these processes will be reviewed by 2028 once countries have had a chance to participate already in at least 2 rounds, right? Every 2 years, 2024, 2026, and 2028. So 3 times the processes will be reviewed. Okay, I wanted to highlight this relationship. So the NDC accounting regime and transparency are very much linked. So when you communicate an NDC, which most countries have already, they have to track progress made in implementing that climate target in their BTR. So this is something important, because if countries have not already been submitting biennial update reports, how are they actually going to get a biennial transparency report together, which is at a higher level of stringency than the existing reporting guidelines require, right? So all of this it's underpinned by several principles that I think all of you can agree are important in terms of achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So environmental integrity, avoiding double counting, making sure that the targets are comparable, consistent, transparent, accurate, and complete. So if you put the TACCC in a slightly different configuration, it's the TAC principles. And this is very important. A lot of countries refer to it as important for NDCs to be accountable and transparent. And I've made a reference here to the reference manual. Anyone who's interested in the Enhanced Transparency Framework, go and read this manual. It gives you a very good overview of what BTRs are about. Now, the key challenges in implementation of the Enhanced Transparency Framework are as follows. At the moment, developing countries, out of 145 or so of them, I believe, only 80 have submitted their first ever biennial update reports, and these were due in 2014. It's 2022. Okay, so there are several countries who have never even submitted a single report. For biennial update report 2, BUR2, 37 countries have done it. BUR3, 24 countries, and BUR4, 10 countries. And the 5th biennial update reports are due this year. And there are several implications of this move. So the existing one is not as stringent, I would say. But if you submit, it indicates that you are ready, right, to submit the Enhanced Transparency Framework. And I'll just highlight here, if anyone's interested in ASEAN countries' track record, so to speak, not particularly great for some countries, right? So of all the Southeast Asian countries, actually, I think only Singapore has been very, very consistent and submitted its biennial update report 4, which was due in 2020. And I believe we're working on our next one for submission this year already. So I've highlighted here, of course, just for sake of discussion, really, that Brunei, Myanmar, and Philippines have not even submitted a single BUR. So how are they going to submit a biennial transparency report in 2024? The learning curve will be extremely, extremely steep. Okay, so just to highlight that if you're interested in researching on this, you can find this all on the UNFCCC website. And all of the sharing, right, the Q&A, FMCP, right, facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, is all available online. Actually, you can actually watch countries present their information. And most recently at COP20, I think it was COP26. I understand that Laos and Cambodia had presented their first biennial update report, so well done to them, of course. And then you have Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand had participated in this year's workshop in Bonn during the Intersessionals in June 2022. And you have a picture there of our chief negotiator, Joseph, presenting for Singapore. So yeah, another thing to consider is that when countries participate, it signals willingness to participate actively, share information, and engage in ways to improve data collection with other countries, right? So we can share, like if we've got some troubles collecting certain types of gases, like information on certain types of gases, we can compare notes, for example, right? And see how we can improve our own processes. And sometimes disclosure and reporting also helps to tap into funding for your country, because the more transparent you are, the more you are inclined to mitigate or manage your emissions, right, from those sectors. And that might open up private sector or government funding for you. So please encourage anyone that you know of in any country, if they haven't already submitted their BURs, to submit their BURs. And work towards the BTRs, of course. I do want to say that if you don't submit a BUTR or Balance Transparency Report, countries actually will be pushed to, they could be referred to the Committee on Implementation and Compliance. So I think some people are generally curious about whether there will be penalties. There's no specific penalty like, oh, you have to pay this amount of money. There's no penalty, but you will be referred to the committee if you consistently not submit NDCs or consistently not submit your BTRs. So it's basically like name and shame, if you think about it. And Rule 18 basically sets out consideration of issues, right? So if a party has not submitted NDC reports or any communications or participated in the FMCP, they could be moved to the committee, right? Which the committee is, I think, about to adopt their rules of procedure by COP for this year. So you see on the first bullet point, their report will be submitted in Sharm-el-Sheik. So yeah, this is how the transparency links with Article 15. Still complicated, but just wanted to highlight to you guys. Okay, and compared to the Kyoto Protocol, is quite different effectively. Okay, Article 6, I think several of you might be interested in this, but I will only go through it very quickly. It was adopted at COP26 much later than the bulk of the rulebook. So the rulebook was agreed in Katowice COP24, if you remember, but Article 6 was only adopted in COP26, 6 years after it was supposed to have been, the mandate came out. And this is because it's extremely technical and a lot of countries couldn't come to agreement and consensus. And our very own Minister for Sustainability and Environment was actually invited by the UK COP presidency, Alok Sharma, to co-facilitate ministerial consultation. So Singapore playing our small little part in the global multilaterally agreed outcomes of Article 6 at COP26. But any of you interested in recent developments under Article 6, you'll see that the Article 6 website keeps getting populated with new things. And so even to prepare for this briefing today, I had to go in and take a look. And most recently, there was hybrid technical workshops held from like 3:30 in the afternoon to 10 p.m. Singapore time. Thankfully, it was broadcasted live online, and then we could participate. Otherwise, it's closed to observers. But so you can click on the links that are provided in the slide deck to see the outcomes of the workshops. And I think the outcomes of the workshops in any case will be presented, of course, at Sharm-el-Sheik later this year, of course, in 21 days. This is something that will be discussed this year, climate finance, because countries haven't concluded their deliberations on a new collective quantified goal for climate finance. They should have done that, I think, last year, but they missed the deadline, so they pushed it forward to agree from 2024 onwards what the goal will be from 2025 onwards. So like I said, the new goal wasn't agreed in Glasgow, but they detailed how countries will go about deliberations for setting the new goal. Global Stocktake is underway already. This is the general framework of the Global Stocktake. It started last year, and the Secretariat has been already collecting a lot of information from various groups, stakeholders, even NUS, who is a formal observer. We can submit our own inputs if we like. We haven't, but we could organize roundtables and submit inputs about targets. And as you can see here, it will conclude at COP28 in 2023, which is in UAE next year. So if any of you are following the GSP, next year's COP will be important to attend, because it will highlight what the collective, whether we are meeting collectively the goals of the Paris Agreement, not exceeding the 1.5 degree threshold, and among other things, right? So this is the overall stock take, very complicated process. But generally, COP26 was able to resolve a number of things, including greater climate ambition, common timeframes, setting a new target, the new process for setting a new target for climate finance. The Glasgow dialogue for loss and damage was agreed. Very arguable that this was, it's not, to me, what I read was that countries were not happy. Several countries were not happy with the outcome for loss and damage. We can cover that a bit further if anyone's interested, because the facility and fund that was supposedly supposed to have been agreed by, well, that was the call of the developing countries anyway, was not agreed. Instead, a Glasgow dialogue was agreed. So Article 6, as I said, was agreed finally, and several transparency tables and capacity building training were agreed in COP26. And just to mention also, I thought that Cambodia and Laos presenting their first VRs was something to be really celebrated. So a quick recap and review of COP26 in Glasgow. Generally, the consensus is that the rule book to the Paris Agreement is finally complete, right? So the other small little things like climate finance, loss and damage, that still need to be worked on, adaptation as well. But there were several pluses and wins that I think generally most people considered Glasgow to be a success, generally. Okay, and I think another thing that for all of you involved in climate education and advocacy work, in particular the Glasgow Sharm-el-Sheik work program on action for climate empowerment is really important, because it establishes a 2-year work program to advance climate education and training as well. So do check it out if you're interested. I don't think we focus a lot on ACE, but there are people who go to COPs that really focus a lot on this. And indigenous communities also, a lot of money was put towards strengthening those communities in light of climate change. So again, I don't think I want to go through in detail, but just to give you a recap of what happened at COP26 and the outcomes. So the key agenda items I've highlighted in bold in this slide. The mitigation work program, adaptation, loss and damage, the new quantified goal for climate finance will be the key focus areas at COP27 in Egypt, as far as negotiations are concerned. There are other issues that ongoing under the subsidiary bodies, like methodological issues that are perennial, right? Updating these methods to calculate emissions and other things, matters relating to reporting and review. Article 6, 6.2, 6.4, 6.8 all have meetings that we will have to sit for as well when we go to COP. So it's not just these bolded areas, but there are other mandated events that we'll still have to go through at the COP, in addition to side events and so on. And just want to keep in mind that we are right now undergoing a number of crises, including the Russia-Ukraine conflict, war, and there's an escalating energy crisis, right? Rising gas prices and supply chain shocks that I think we might see countries not submitting particularly ambitious revised NDCs as called for by the Glasgow Climate Pact, simply because they just they want to get through the winter, right? And also, but keeping in mind also on the flip side, we've got countries like Pakistan, like those in the Latin American countries, Dominican Republic, that have also experienced a lot of floods recently, and even South Australia, I recently heard. So I think something to think about is how all of these recent climate-induced, or climate-related disasters will factor in or influence the COP27 in Africa. What to expect? Mitigation parties they have already met at the ministerial level, and the idea is to recommend a draft decision on mitigation to CMA. in a manner that supports the global stocktake, right? So it's a procedural outcome, not really, we're not expecting countries to increase their emissions and their mitigation ambition by X% or anything, nothing particularly substantive. We will only know when we receive all the NDC's updates, and only 20-something countries have submitted them, so it's not great as of now. Finance, as I mentioned several times, the new quantified goal, or at least a process to set it by 2024 will be agreed in COP27. Stocktake, I mentioned earlier already, the process is underway. Loss and damage, okay, developing countries are calling strongly for a creation of a loss and damage finance facility or fund, and to operationalize the loss and damage Santiago network. Okay, so then the new NDCs, and then finally, finance is being asked to, the discussion on finance is being asked to talk about adaptation and asking countries also to revise their NDCs and national adaptation, NAPs, national adaptation plans, right? And further progress is also to be made on the global goal on adaptation, sorry, not global goal on adaptation in Egypt, established under Article 7.1 of the Paris Agreement. And specifically, I think many of you, or some of you might be interested in loss and damage. I think this is a real pain point for many countries that have suffered irreversible or are undergoing long-term damage, slow onset events with regard to climate change. So this is going to be, I think, one of the more controversial issues to be discussed at COP27, considering it is an African COP again. And I think an encouraging piece of news is that countries, although they haven't formally admitted the causality that they've caused climate change through the Industrial Revolution, because paying this money might effectively be an admittance, right? But obviously historical responsibility can't be proven as, anyway, I'll leave it to the lawyers to decide. But point is, countries like Denmark, right, have announced that they would commit money outside of the COP process, right, outside of the UNFCCC process towards loss and damage. And then you have Scotland and a region of Belgium, Wallonia, also pledging money to help countries offset their climate-induced damage, which in some cases are irreversible. So I think some encouraging news, but just keep in mind this is happening outside of the COP process, and it doesn't necessarily mean that countries will commit to loss and damage funding within the COP process, which, as you can imagine, politically speaking, could be controversial, because it would be as good as admitting that we have caused climate change and therefore we ought to pay for your damages. Yeah, it's extremely political. Okay, finally, I'm just going to take a little bit more time, and please indulge me in this. How to navigate COP27 when you are there. It will take place in November this year. It starts on a Sunday and not a Monday as usual. So it's 6th of November, Sunday, at the Sharm-el-Sheik International Convention Center. It's also known as the Tonino Lamborghini International Convention Center in Egypt. And the Egyptian Minister for Foreign Affairs, Sameh Shoukry, is the COP27 president designate. So he will oversee the COP. And so the Glasgow COP26 presidency will hand over obviously the COP to him when we begin on the 6th of November. And of course, COP27 being an African COP is also kickstarting the decade for implementation, right? So let's move beyond talking about the Paris Agreement, negotiating, and let's move towards implementing it right now. This is what the COP27 site, the venue looks like. And as you can see, if you plan to be there, please bring comfortable walking shoes, because from registration and security to get to the plenaries, which are in purple, it's at least a 10-minute walk, depending how fast you walk. I short legs, so we'll probably take longer than 10 minutes, but like if you walk fast, you should be able to get there quicker. And to various meeting rooms, it's about 5 minutes, among other things. So depending, again, where you stay, where your drop-off points will be, this is how you would navigate the COP. And there'll be signages within the COP venue itself, so don't worry. And there'll be side events if some of you are doing side events. I want to talk a little bit about access. So if you're not already signed up to attend, because if you don't have somebody accrediting you and you haven't been issued a letter of letter of, I don't know what it's called, authorization, I think, to attend UNFCCC, it's quite unlikely that you will get to go this year because there's a quota that's been issued, and it's very hard to find badges around this time, especially we're 21 days away. So there are some offsite events where badges are not required, like in the green zone, but honestly, it's quite expensive. And if you really wanted to go, just to go to the non-badged areas, yeah, I'm not very sure how valuable it is, because a lot of the important stuff, negotiations takes place with a badge required access. Okay. There are different kinds of badges, and I think many of you, if you're going for the Singapore Pavilion, you will be party overflow badged. So you'll be the Max Masterman in the picture there, right? So your picture, you go there and take a picture, and then it'll be on your badge, and then you'll be considered party overflow. If you go with NUS, so some of you are going with NUS, like I am, we will have a yellow badge, which is for observers. And again, you have access as well to various things that are open to observers. At some points in the week, for example, high level, where some heads of states might attend, you might be required to get an additional ticket. And you see the second picture there, it might look like that. So an NGO badge, like if I'm an observer, yellow badge, I might need an NGO ticket to access the plenary. Or you might get a ticket like the one in the bottom, which is to attend a smaller working group or contact group meeting, right? So look out for these. And if you're with NUS, don't worry, I'll be there. So I'll guide you through the process. Usually where these tags are given out, extra tickets are given out, is if you're NUS, then it's in the morning at the Research and Independent NGO meeting. But I'll just warn you now, not everybody gets the badges because they're usually limited to 5 or 8 or whatever. And the chairs of the meeting will usually try and give it out to a diverse group of people. So let's say we're the only Asia Pacific representation from the region, then of course we'll get it lah. But if there are more people going from the region, then the chairs might say, hey, give chance to other people to go. Okay, so just to highlight, access, try and manage your expectations with these badges, because not everybody gets to go into different meetings. Okay, and then okay, I want to add visa. If you haven't already gotten your visa, please, and if you're from Singapore, my recommendation personally is to go directly to the Egyptian Embassy in Central Mall on the 25th floor. They only open from 10 a.m. to 12 noon, Mondays to Fridays. Takes about 2 to 4 working days to get your visa processed. And if any of you need the list of things that you need to bring, you can drop me a note after this as well. Okay, so basically access, very important. Try and get everything sorted before you go, and also manage your expectations on what kinds of rooms you can go in. Plenary, so I'm going through the start meeting so you know exactly what to expect when you're there. Plenary meetings are generally open to everyone, okay, depending on room size. At times when a big high-level speaker is speaking, you might need to get that extra ticket to go in, or you might be asked to sit in the balcony seating because the floor is usually reserved for countries' representatives. Okay, so generally the meeting of the supreme bodies, the COP, the CMP, CMA, will be seated in this plenary format. And when countries meet in this format, translation is available in the 6 UN languages. All right. In other rooms, sorry, don't have. Okay. Usually NGO constituency statements are allowed at the end, but I think the Secretary is trying to be a bit more flexible and inserting different NGO statements in between, because what sometimes happens is that the countries get a bit impatient and then they walk out, and it's really not very nice to observers having prepared all their statements and then they deliver and nobody's in the room to listen to it. Yeah, so if you are part of a RINGO, Research and Independent NGO like NUS, you could put your name forward as someone to present the NGO constituency statement on behalf of all of the world's research and independent NGOs. And I believe for SYCA, our very own Lastrina Hamid, who founded, one of the co-founders of SYCA, had spoken on behalf of the Youngos or youth NGOs at Paris, in Paris COP21. Okay, so this is where things get a bit tricky, especially those of you who are badged with the party overflow badges this year. My understanding is that you have to follow whatever rules you had agreed to with whoever is badging you. But contact group meetings are usually open to observers, but do check the TV screens and announcements. So the rules are as follows. If 1/3 of the parties at the convention bodies or the supreme bodies agree and to set up a contact group, object the presence of observers, then the room will be closed. What will happen is that the chairs of the session will, if you do end up in those rooms, the chairs of the session will politely ask observers to vacate, like, please leave. And then the security will come and check your color of your badge. Okay, so if you have a yellow badge and you're an observer, you'll be asked to leave the room. I do not recommend that if you have undersigned some document telling the government that you will not attend, I do not recommend hiding with a party overflow badge in the back, because if they happen to figure out you're there, that could be, I don't know, right? But do check and do behave appropriately. At any time during proceedings, presiding officers can also determine if the contact group will be closed to observers. So please just listen to the security, because one thing I must highlight is that one person being thrown out of the COP, being blacklisted, could affect everybody else, especially if you're badged in an observer with an observer organization. So if, let's say, somebody from NUS flouts the rules, then the entire group could be denied entry for the entire duration henceforth. So please do not try to do anything funny. Just listen to security and then kind of look for me as a contact point for NUS, okay? Yeah, so constituency statements allowed, time permitting, but I rarely see NGOs giving statements during contact group meetings. Informals, okay, so informals kind of look like a smaller room, is first come, first serve seating arrangements. Do not sit at the main table if you can. If you're an observer, sit at the back. So observers are typically asked to observe from the back. And again, if established by a contact group, informals are usually closed, but the chairs will encourage it to remain open. If they're established by the plenary, right? So if the plenary session says we establish a informal straight away, not contact group, then the first and last of these informals may be open. But then the parties might choose to keep it closed. So check the CCTV announcements every single day, every single hour that you can, to make sure that you're in the right room and that you are not sort of in a closed room setting. Okay, and again, they will politely ask you to leave if they find you in a room anyway. Informals do not go, because these are drafting group meetings, they're spin-off groups, they're friends of the chair or heads of delegation level meetings. You're not invited if you are an observer. And if you're not formally part of a government delegation, but this is kind of how it looks like, right? Countries will sit around the table and negotiate a piece of text, and things sometimes get heated. That's why your positions are the red lines will come out, so you're not invited to join. Huddles are quite interesting. You can technically join if you can get into the group or the negotiating floor, typically, and this is how it would look like, how it looks like, and this was actually a real huddle that I saw and I took a picture of. But like I said, they happen in an ad hoc manner, countries sometimes coming together to discuss a particular outcome. And like I said, if you can get into the middle or somewhere that you can hear, by all means, it is kind of open to observers if you're in the room already. Side events probably most relevant to observers. You have to submit an application via an accredited organization. So all side events will be live webcasted and available, I think, to view on demand still. And you can go to the side events website via UNFCCC to check out the whole list. I have a picture of how it would look like later. Okay, so just to highlight to you again, the protocol is that if the room is full, party representatives have priority over observers. And party reps must be allowed to sit at the table. And what this sometimes means is that if you're late to a meeting, you will either sit in the back or on the floor. During COVID, I think they didn't even allow more than the number of seats in the room. So to just look around your surroundings and figure out like whether you're welcome in that room. If there's space, you can stand around the back if you're not obstructing anyone. And if you happen to be in a room, or you're queuing up to enter a room that has the negotiations happening inside, sometimes you just have to wait, because negotiation trumps NGO meetings, right? So yeah, you don't chase them out, because you are asked to go to the meeting room assignment team to get another room. Okay, second week, usually high levels. So high-level segment is where heads of state, government, reps, dignitaries will come and speak based on the rank of the speaker. So we'll start with head of state, then Minister for Foreign Affairs, Minister for Environment, and so on. But check the website. I don't think the list is out yet for the order of speaking. And usually Pride Singapore will give a national statement of some sort. And don't worry, there's usually simultaneous delivery in another room if you can't get into the main plenary room. And sometimes if you want to go into the main room, you might need a ticket for access. If you are not going to the COP and you still want to check in and navigate it virtually, you can go onto the UNFCCC website. You can also download the app, which I already have on my phone. So you can download the app on and track them on social media as well. This is how the live CCTV schedule looks like. The timing, the title of the meeting, so the agenda item, and the conference room that you want to go to, and figure out ahead of time how to get there, because sometimes it's really very far. Okay, so you might have to leave like 5-10 minutes early of your last meeting just to get to the next room. But I find this very helpful, this link to have on your phone in your browser, so you have it ready. If you're interested in attending only side events or checking out the live stream, this is a really great website because you can actually drop tab and click on the topic that you're interested in. So for me, if I'm interested in enhanced transparency framework, I'll just click on it and then print out the whole document, the whole page, and then figure out which one I want to go for. But it's a really great resource for anyone who wants to learn more about, so it's basically like seminars lah, like side events are basically like seminars. Okay, so before you go to COP, also try and read up on the provisional agendas for the supreme bodies, COP27, CMP17, CMA4, and the subsidiary bodies. Sometimes the presiding officers also offer scenario notes and pre-session documents for you to track. And then at the end of the COP, these will result in reports of the session, which you can check on the documents and decisions website as well. I'm coming to the end, I promise. So for those of you who are going to COP, do note that I checked and it does look like this COP will be a cashless COP. So use debit or credit cards only, or I think they'll have some kind of digital wallet, and there'll be a variety of restaurants, grab and go coffee stations, and VIP restaurants and food carts and trucks for you to get Egyptian food and international cuisine. So, but it is also, of course, recommended if you bring some snacks into meetings, if you're trying to save some money, or if you're snacky. Singapore Pavilion, I won't go into detail, and for those of you who are participating, I think the information sheet has been sent to you already, so the web link is available. I just won't show it here for now because I think it's still in a beta testing mode, but this is what the Singapore Pavilion should look like, based on the illustration by Pico, and look forward to seeing all of you there. We'll be having a couple of panels on the 16th of November on Nature-Based Solutions Day. So for anybody else who's interested, if you want to engage with the COP, what you can do is develop position papers with other like-minded people, NGOs as well, meetings, hold meetings with delegates, share papers and submissions to explore the different policies that you're interested in. And of course, advocate, engage with social media and showcase your work at various things. But all these has to be planned before, right? So don't wait, it's 21 days to go. We're getting a bit stressed. I'm part of the Ringos steering committee. So Ringos is a really great resource. We post a lot of things about how to get to COP and what to do there. And also, I'll just put this up for a bit. CNCS is organizing a pre-COP event and to talk about the expectations that WWF colleagues have for COP27. So Sandeep from WWF International will share on adaptation and loss and damage, and Swati, I can't remember what I've asked her to share about, but Swati is also a member of SYCA, and she'll also be sharing about her expectations out of COP26. And Audrey Tan from the Straits Times will be moderating that discussion at University Hall on the 27th of October from 4 to 5:30 p.m. So I've included the QR code here if any of you want to take a screenshot or register now. I'm also speaking on Second Nature and Ringo talk on 7 a.m. on Tuesday, October 25th. Key issues to watch. I'll be talking a bit more in detail about the mitigation work program and Article 6 if any of you are keen. Finally, there are a bunch of really great material, daily program, eco newsletter. Earth Negotiation Fluency is also great. They do a great curtain raiser every start of the COP. So it's like 20 pages, history of COP. history of COP21 to 26 or something. Third World Network and various other guidebooks, I think are very helpful if any of you are interested to go to the COP or are going or plan to go next year. Other tools, if you're on Twitter, there are these very good Twitter handles you can follow. I particularly like the In-Session Documents Twitter account because you can just refresh and get the documents straight away and not have to go and surf the FCCC website. And the Negotiator app, as I mentioned earlier, is available both for Android and Apple phones. Okay, finally, I'm done. If you have any questions about any of the above, I'm happy to take them later, but I want to hand the time off to Kate, who will talk to you about the SYCA youth position paper, as well as what SYCA, what exciting stuff they're doing at the COP this year. I just want to say thank you, and sorry I went over time, but I was a lot to cover and happy to take any questions via the chat. Okay, stop share, and over to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Mel. Okay, that was super comprehensive. And I just want to say, if anyone else is overwhelmed, I think like everyone else in this room is, and it's very normal, so don't worry. I was planning to kind of share about SYCA's history and how we came about, but I'm going to skip past that because of time constraints. Also, if you hear background noise, it's because it's a Friday night where I am, so people are out partying and getting drunk. Just ignore it. But yeah, SYCA is a youth-led organization, completely volunteer-run, and we actually started, or our co-founders started this group back in 2015 at COP21 because they saw a need for Singaporeans to be represented at international climate change negotiations, and specifically getting young Singaporeans to these spaces. And so in COP26, Swati and Cheryl, who are members of SYCA, they attended, and they met the rest of the Singapore delegation. They also hosted a panel at the Thai Pavilion. So really exciting stuff. This year is really special because, so Singapore is actually like the Singapore Pavilion that Mel mentioned. This is the first time that we are doing it at COP. And they actually invited some members of SYCA to go with them on a government badge or like a party badge. So from SYCA this year, we have 3 people attending: Rishika, Therese, and myself. And the really special thing is that Rishika and Therese are going on the party batch. So they will technically be considered like part of the Singapore delegation, whereas I'm going on an NGO batch, so observer status. And we also want to give a shout out to CDL and MSE for funding our trip. My batch is personally coming from Climate Action Network Southeast Asia, so really thankful to them as well. So I'm just going to be sharing a bit more about what SYCA is doing at COP27 this year. And the first thing we are doing is a panel about what climate activism, youth climate activism looks like in an Asian context. So I think for those of you who've been for international conferences, you kind of know that the Western like narratives tend to dominate a lot, even amongst the activists and even amongst youth activists. So we hope that through this panel session, we can kind of showcase different modes of activism. Mel, Rishika, Teen, and Therese will all be speaking on it, and they come from all very diverse backgrounds. So we're really excited to kind of show that activism isn't just like us versus them. It's also about working with the government or with the other systems in your country. It's actually going to be on a Sunday, and I hope the time conversion is correct, but it should be at 8 p.m. Singapore time. So it will be live casted, and you're like so welcome to join from Singapore as well. Or if you're going to be at Egypt, you can join us in person at the Singapore Pavilion. And the second thing we want to do, which I really want to spend more time talking about, is we're developing an environmental community policy paper. So for those of you who were following COP26 last year, you may have recalled that a group of Singapore youth, including Teen, who is here today, I think, they came together to draft a really comprehensive kind of position paper with a lot of different recommendations that they submitted to the Singapore government. And Therese, Rishika, and I felt that since we are going all the way to COP27 this year, we really want to continue building on that momentum and on that work. So in case you're not familiar with the recommendations from last year, it basically covered 6 themes, and I'll just go through them really quickly. The first is about emissions and targets, so Singapore's net zero targets, nature and biodiversity, also energy, in terms of our country's like energy reporting and how youth can be brought into the energy space as well. There are recommendations on corporate responsibility and fossil fuel financing. Also, community empowerment and inclusion. So, for example, in all the government consultations with the green community, is it like an actual consultation process or is it just a one-way kind of process? And finally, the last theme is economy and people. So this is especially pertinent, I think, with Singapore's carbon tax increase and talking about how we can make that carbon tax effective from an environmental perspective, but also fair from a social perspective. So these were the recommendations that were covered last year, and we are basically using these themes to guide our policy paper this year. This video is basically just to give a shout out to whoever put it together last year. It really was very impressive. And I really urge all of you to go and take a look if you haven't already. But what we are trying to do different this year is to make the entire process a bit more inclusive and consultative. And so we've held engagements with the green community in Singapore to kind of get everyone's input. And there are a lot of different people working on this with us. So if you're keen to join the process, also just feel free to reach out to me after this. So apart from the panel and this policy paper, what else are we doing at COP? I think one important thing is social media, because the entire process throughout the 2 weeks can be very, very overwhelming. And I say this from personal experience, like last year when COP26, I didn't attend personally, but I was trying to follow updates from Singapore and it was really difficult. So we hope that while we are there, we can come up with different kinds of like summaries and short form content for people and specifically contextualize it to Singapore so that you guys can stay updated on what's happening. And I just want to highlight that in the lead up to COP, we're also doing a bunch of different activities to engage communities here in Singapore. So we did outreach at Botanic Gardens back in September. We've been working on a workshop series, and this has 5 parts to it. So the first one, which was in August, was on Singapore's climate policy trajectory. The second one was about Singapore's parliamentary processes, things like who are the MPs who are speaking up for climate in Singapore's parliament, and also how we as young people can contribute to that policymaking process. So that was just very recently, and we have 3 more workshops to come. So super exciting stuff. And I think one important thing from the workshops, this is personally my favorite part about SYCA, which is that like the participants from the first workshop, some of them actually went on to help us plan the second workshop. And I think at the end of the day, that's kind of SYCA's goal in terms of bringing more people into the movement and not just like educating them and then it stops there, but really getting them to help us plan and organize as well. So yeah, that really sums it up. I just want to highlight different ways that people can contribute to SYCA's work. Like I said, our policy paper, with the 21-day deadline, we are hoping to get it out before that as well. So we really need all hands on deck. You don't have to be part of any organization in Singapore. As long as you have interest in environmental community, you are welcome to help us. The second thing is we need a social media team for COP27 because like I said, we want to curate, summarize content. So we do need people for that. And the third is if you want to help us with our policy workshops or even come as a participant, do reach out. And the QR code that you see on the screen, that's to join our Telegram channel where we talk about different volunteering opportunities with our group. Yeah, okay. 10 minutes. I think I did good on time. So we want to give time for Q&A as well. So yeah, I'll hand the time back to you, Mel.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. That was really great. I'm looking forward to the paper. And really great workshop. I attended the second one at the IUEC, the Inter-University Environment Conference. I thought it was very, very well attended. Shout out to Rachel and team for organizing it. Okay, so this is the part where we invite questions. You're very welcome to unmute your mics, turn on your videos and engage with us. We have about half an hour. And we can talk about anything. If we don't know the answers, we can always refer you to the right people. So there's no such thing as a silly question. And this is a briefing for everyone. So we want to keep it as inclusive as possible. Yeah, shoot, if any of you have questions. You can also tell us how you feel in the chat. The first one's always the hardest.
I can start us off just to get the ball rolling. Because you've been for so many COPs, right? What does the Singapore delegation typically look like in terms of like across all the different kinds of badges? Who are the people who usually attend?
Oh, that's actually an easy one to answer. You can go on the UNFCCC website. Every COP, there is a provisional list of participants that are, you're registered, your name is on the list. And so you can actually go in and see for yourself who attends these meetings from any country. It doesn't just have to be from our country, but the provisional list will usually tell you that NCCS will attend, Ministry of Sustainability Environment, Ministry of Trade and Industry, NParks, and then depending on the topics that are covered, I guess. So the officials that go, because they're working on these issues back home, right? So Ministry of Foreign Affairs typically will attend as well. It's a range, and yeah, they're all extremely busy every time they go to a COP, right? Assigned to different meetings to cover them. So yeah, it's the delegation is staffed from various ministries across Singapore who deal with climate change, and I think it's also representative typically of the Interministerial Committee on Climate Change institutional arrangement that we have in Singapore, where if anyone's involved in developing climate policy in Singapore, it typically has to take some cues from the outcomes or ongoing negotiations as a COP, right? Because you have to adjust your workflow when you're back home in order to adhere to the guidelines and submit your reports on time. So I think it makes sense to send people whose jobs will be affected, right? And not just those who can negotiate, but also whose jobs will be adjusted so that their work feeds into the new workflows and processes to, for example, submit a biotransparency report by 2024 or participate in Article 6 mechanisms and so on. Does that answer the question, more or less? Okay, maybe we can take Akbar's question.
Hi, everyone. This is Akbar. Thank you. I think it's a very long question, but we've done this before at an event, at a conference, where we kind of put out a quick brief about who we are and what we intend to achieve at the conference. And while we're all networking, since we're such a small group of people that are going, this might be an opportunity for us to kind of look out for each other. And if we meet someone, we kind of connect the dots. It kind of allows us to fast track the networking as well. It's just an idea. It's been effective before, but if it's already being done, maybe we could kind of get access to that so we can look out for each other.
Yeah, sure. There's a small group of us. When we do go to COP, we put together a WhatsApp group, but I think everyone is like swamped
sure.
we're swamped with WhatsApp groups. So I'm not sure with the number of participants going with the pavilion this year, it makes sense. But certainly, I'm sure there are smaller groups there.
Sorry, Mel. What I meant was, instead of it being a chatty group, it's more of like just a document of a brief of what we intend to achieve, just a goal and objective, and who are the key stakeholders that we're looking out for. So it kind of, when you're having drinks with someone at a conference or a coffee, you kind of meet someone and you say, hey, I know this person from Singapore that's looking out for this. So it kind of allows us to just connect the dots, but it's only, we're just trying to take the extra mile for each other if we have the capacity to do that. It can be quite overwhelming when we get to these conferences sometimes.
Yeah. I agree.
Think I can speak on SYC's behalf that we are all very stretched, but if Akbar, you would like to take this up and link everyone up, I think that would be amazing.
Okay, happy to do something online. Sure. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for the suggestion. And I also put in the provisional list of participants from last year, the plop from last year in the chat, if anyone's interested to take a look. Anyone else had questions? We have somewhere to go, 27 minutes. No questions, everyone's prepared for COP.
Hi, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Hi, so this is Darren here. So I would just like to ask, right, what are some of the things that you all hope to see, right, from, let's say, the COP27 negotiations and stuff like that? Yeah.
What we hope to see, well, first thing I would say, come to the COP27 lecture series on the 27th of October. WWF, I think, has a very strong history of putting out position papers prior to the COPs, and as you know, they're very important NGO as well. They've got some views on what should be achieved. Typically for NUS, as part of the research and independent NGOs, we don't take strong positions on what countries should do. We track the negotiations and we figure out what has to be done back home domestically when when countries come back from the COPs. We don't advocate for any particular position. That's not usually the university's role. And we figure out what kind of research needs to be done, what kind of resources to be put in. So I will hold off on answering that question. But Kate, do you have any views on what you're expecting out of COP this year?
I mean, I think our policy paper will cover quite a bit of that, Darren. If you want to reach out separately, we can talk about it, because we are actually embargoing it for now to maximize the impact when we do release it.
Mm. When can we expect the paper? Just before COP?
When my exams end. I think probably in the next 1.5 weeks, actually.
Okay,
Yeah.
Cool. Cool. Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Darren, for the question. Yeah, I think it depends on who you ask. Their request, they're thinking about what outcomes work for them will be different. So I think that's also something important to think about with regard to these international negotiations, right? Depending which country you're from, your interests are vastly different from the next country, can be vastly different. So I don't want to claim to speak on behalf of any particular country, but you might want to think about what outcomes would mean for ours versus what it would mean for others, and then how to get to a compromise in a multilateral setting over 2 weeks, right? And work has been ongoing all this time while we're speaking, right? It's not that they meet only twice a year in June in Bonn and then end of the year. There's always ongoing correspondence between countries as well. And offsite meetings, online meetings to inch towards an outcome at the end. Okay, Shikin's question. Okay, so the presentation, I will find a way to circulate it. I think if you're registered with us, shouldn't be a problem. We'll also figure out where to post this recording if you need to refer to anything else that I've said, but we'll send it around to those who have registered for this briefing this morning. And Zen has asked, I'm hoping to attend COP next year. What are the NGOs that I can reach out to engage, or is it invitation only? Okay, so if you're with NUS or if you are an alumni, of course, you're very welcome to come and apply via NUS. But we do have a criteria because our spots are typically limited to around between 6 to 8 packs only. In Singapore, there are actually a very limited number of NGOs that are accredited with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I'll find the link right after this. You can go on to admitted NGOs on UNFCCC, and there's a list. You just Control F, look for Singapore. I think there are only 6 NGOs in Singapore that are registered, and if they don't send people regularly, or if they only send 1 or 2 every year, then the algorithm to assign badges will stick with 1 or 2 every year. So because NUS has consistently sent first year we sent 3 or 4, and then 5 or 6, and then now we get about 7 badges, around 7 more or less. But so there is an algorithm behind it, and if the NGOs don't consistently send people, the COP Secretariat takes the badges away. So my sense is that work with an NGO, whether it's from Singapore or international, to help get you badged to go to COP next year. And apply early. Don't wait until like 3 months. Or I had somebody email me this week. I'm like, no. The nominations for NGOs this year closed on 31st July. So it's, we try and get the information out to as many people as possible ahead of time, but there are usually, the demand usually exceeds supply in terms of badges to attend. But you're very welcome to apply to international NGOs, and they might offer you a badge, but then you have to find funding for yourself to go. Does that help, Zen? You're welcome. Kate?
I was also just going to add that it's not invite only. I think if you take the initiative early enough, like even I started asking like last November or December, because it's really quite competitive, because there are only so many badges they can give. And I would say like, don't limit yourself to Singapore. If you go through the full list of accredited organizations, which I think Mel may send, you'll find a lot, not just in Southeast Asia, but you can also try reaching out to like US-based ones, because there tend to be a lot more NGOs and they don't always maximize the badges. Yeah.
Yeah, I've added the link, but I don't know if it's the right one. They've updated the SYCA website. Oh, right. I think I might. Okay. Any other questions? Not okay. Do you want to talk about the panel that you're organizing at the pavilion?
Sure. So one more thing about the pavilion is that we actually got opportunities to submit content for exhibitions. So for SYCA, we really wanted youth to be represented there. So we submitted a list of like ground up initiatives that Singapore youth have done. Hopefully it gets approved. But for the panel itself, that will be taking place 6 November, Sunday. And like I said, it's really just to showcase different modes of activism, because I think going to a space like COP, there's a lot of polarizing issues, and there's also a lot of different takes on climate activism, in terms of like, oh, you have to hold a sign, get out on the streets and protest. And obviously in Singapore, we can't do that, right? So I think bringing the Asia context to COP and kind of just showcasing it to other countries, but also really just like learning from them as well and bringing their insights back to our country. And I like personally, I feel that's the most exciting part about conferences. So for the panel, we'll just be talking about like what young people in Singapore have done. And it isn't always just like social media activism, which I feel is what people deem as activism in Singapore. I think what Mel is doing with her research and capacity building work, that is also a form of activism in itself. So we just really want to highlight that to the panel.
Cool. Very excited about it on the first day, right? 6th of November. Anyone else? Don't be shy. Or any questions about Paris Agreement? I'm also happy to take questions on that.
Melissa.
Hi.
It's Aisha.
Hi, Aisha.
Hi. So yes, I do have a question. It is on the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So like you showed, like Kyoto Protocol has, come into force in 2020. So how is it different from Paris Agreement in terms of like the goals of the emissions reduction?
Oh, okay. So the Kyoto Protocol, as I shared earlier, was primarily for, I mean, of course, the goal was to reduce climate change, but at the time, the thinking was that only the countries who, were industrialized in the 2000s, right, would be required to set up quantified emissions reductions and limitations objectives, CALROs for short. And this collectively came up to 5.2% of global emissions from 1990 levels. And there is a table in the Kyoto Protocol annexes that speak to what amounts per country. And they're not all equal. Actually, some countries like Australia actually had an increase, like they were allowed an increase in the emissions. But point really is, Kyoto Protocol was designed back then with the thinking that the countries that are industrialized and have the capacity, and there were two principles that underpin the design of the Kyoto Protocol, them being historical responsibility and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. But those two principles, not that they're not important, but I think it was very clear that some countries like the US would find it very challenging, or they would find it very difficult to admit themselves into a new agreement like the Paris Agreement if bigger emitters, big emitters like China, India, and so on would not be a part of it, right? Because it has implications on their competitiveness. So it's not fair, so to speak, right? I know it's a bit strange, but the point really being is that in order for Paris Agreement as a successor to the Kyoto Protocol to work, all countries had to be involved. So I think the key difference really from the Kyoto Protocol moving forward to the Paris Agreement is the coverage of countries, number one, and the design of the NDCs being slightly more bottom up, right? So countries determine the targets themselves, they put it forward so that they feel more comfortable coming to the table, rather than being assigned a target number, which I'm sure nobody likes, to be assigned a target, right? Considering your national circumstances. So that would be the answer.
Right. So actually, like my question is like when like the meetings happened, like in the COP27, actually. So the meeting for the Kyoto Protocol, like how is it different from the meeting for the Conference of the Parties for the Paris Agreement? Actually, like my question is more of like moving ahead. Yeah.
So there are some outstanding issues under the Kyoto Protocol that have got to be discussed. In terms of modality and format, probably looks very similar. So it'll all be contact groups, informals, informals, so on and so forth. But the topics themselves will be decided based on the past mandates. So decision 1 CMP such and such, right? CMP 16 from last year. So whatever minutes to the meeting of CMP, right? Meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol from last year, you have to check that agenda. You have to check those decisions and what is being carried forward into COP CMP 17 this year under the Kyoto Protocol. And then check the annotated agenda for COP27 and then go to the meetings that you want to go to. One of the key ones this year is transition of the Clean Development Mechanism. And so the Clean Development Mechanism is a flexibility mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol, but it's being transitioned into Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, right? So you can have all these new rules for Article 6.4, but decisions have to be taken under the CMP, the governing body of the Kyoto Protocol. So some of the rules will just have to, the meetings will just have to talk to one another and come up with coordinated decisions by November 18th.
Perfect. It is clear now.
Okay, yeah. So if you, usually the secretariat and the co-chairs for all these meetings will try not to overlap the related meetings, right? So if the same set of negotiators from a small country have to be in two places at once, it's impossible. So they will try and put these meetings maybe back to back or a day after each other, so that negotiators have time to go back and confer with one another, with their groups, right? And then come back the next day or the afternoon to another body, whether it's transitioning between the CMA, SAPSA and CMP and their relevant SAPSA meetings or otherwise. I know, alphabet soup. Anyone else?
I have a logs question. So I got my e-visa yesterday. Is that sufficient?
Should be.
That's it?
If it's accredited by the Egyptian government.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then why did you recommend people going down to the
I
embassy?
don't know. I didn't get mine, even though I applied via the e-route on the COP27 website.
Oh, I applied through like the paid one.
Oh, yeah. So, right, if you have the letter, it's free. So we went to the embassy and we're getting our visas for free.
Oh, okay. So it's a cost thing.
I don't know. I mean, maybe it was just overwhelmed and I couldn't find the right links to go to get the e-visa. Even if it's paid, we could have just paid. But yeah, we just made the trip down to Clarke Quay. Yeah, thanks. So we have about 10 minutes. Any other questions, Kate, since you're the only one asking? No?
Hi, may I ask a question? Thank
Yes,
you for
hi,
your
Steffi.
presentation. I was curious to know more about like funding, climate funding for countries that are more impacted. Because just now you mentioned that if wealthier countries do it through the COP mechanism, then it kind of suggests that they cause climate change. Is it? So how?
Well, that's my observation. I think you have to go back to some of the history of loss and damage. It's been many years. I think probably a decade thereabouts. You know, where small islands have been calling for reparations, right? They've been asking for money because the damage to them, I mean, it's like erosion, coastal erosion, like they will never get that land back, you know, that beach back. But I think some might tell you that it's really hard to determine the causality that a country has emitted this amount of emissions that caused the tipping point that made the waves, you know, erode that beach. So it's a bit tricky. And I'm sure I'm missing out a lot of detail in terms of why developed countries are hesitant to commit to a disaster relief or insurance facility under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. Even the governance of the WIM at the COP is also contested, right? So whether it's governed by the COP or the meetings of the parties to the Paris Agreement as a sub-treaty or treaty under the COP is also contentious. And I haven't followed loss and damage very closely, but I know who does. So Sandeep from WWF, and he's coming to speak on the 27th. So if I'm happy to link you out with him as well. He's been tracking this for like a long time, adaptation and loss and damage. So I would recommend talking to him about why countries might be not keen, and whether or not, I mean, it's realistic, right? for countries to be waiting for this money to drop from somewhere, whether they should actually put aside national budgets to adapt to climate change. In some ways, we have done it here, right? We're not waiting for other people to finance our adaptation measures. So the question is really, can it be funded? And if so, how much? But if not, then what do countries do? They can't just keep asking for money every year, right? And not do anything. So there must be more that we can, maybe something else we can think of to help them. Just as an example, Southeast Asia has our own facility called SYCA, Southeast Asia Disaster Relief something fund, insurance, I think, an insurance fund or facility, SYCA. So that's something that I think partners like China, Korea, and Japan have funded for specific Southeast Asian countries. It was launched in 2018. So I think regionally, I think perhaps more can be done for disaster relief and humanitarian aid if need be during these climate-induced disasters. But whether or not it should be done at the COP, I'm sure some people feel that way, but others feel like it's too high level already. Yeah, to have anything meaningful done. Could be good signaling though, like Denmark. But thanks for the question, Becky.
I see. Thanks for the explanation.
Anyone else? We're coming up to lunchtime, so I think people are getting a bit hungry or tired. And it's almost midnight for you, Kate.
My bedtime is at 10:30.
Oh no, okay.
I'm a grandma.
But you're studying also, so it makes sense. Okay, last call for last question, and then we'll wrap up just before 12. Anything else? But of course, I mean, this doesn't have to be it. You have our details. You can connect with SYCA via their social media, and I'm sure they have an email address posted on their websites as well, various social media sites. And my email was also shared earlier at the end of my slide. So feel free to contact us if you have any further questions. And thank you everyone for all your well wishes to COP. Yeah, we're gonna be hibernating the next 3 weeks to prepare all that we need to prepare. But thank you. And when we get back, we're gonna have a final COP27 lecture at NUS on the 1st of December. So look out for details of that as well if you want to find out what the outcomes of COP27 were. So I guess if nobody else has a question, we can wrap up 5 whole minutes early.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I'll stop recording now. Stop recording.